It started like most land disputes do, quiet, bureaucratic, and full of paperwork no one bothers to read until it's too late. I had inherited the land from my grandfather, who had inherited it from his, and for nearly a century it sat undisturbed. A peaceful stretch of forest and pasture with a winding stream that fed into a narrow reservoir tucked into a natural basin. My family had dammed that stream in the 1960s, reinforced it in the 80s, and used it primarily for irrigation and fishing, a private retreat where summers were spent hauling in trout and winters were for fixing fences. The land had no structures, no public roads, and no easements on record. But that didn't stop the Crestwood Pines HO from making the single worst decision in their history, building an entire subdivision on what they believed was an unclaimed extension of a nearby development. It began with a shady developer who cut corners, then vanished. He had faked a boundary survey and claimed my land was part of the original community's expansion. The HOA, hungry to boost property values and expand dues-paying membership, bought. The pitch wholesale, roads were paved, sewer lines were dug, foundations poured. Within 18 months, they'd built 35 homes, landscaped, and even installed streetlights, all without realizing they were trespassing on every inch of my legally documented, tax-paid, and privately owned property. I hadn't noticed at first, because the land sat on the far end of the basin and I lived out of state most of the year. But the moment I returned that spring to do a routine inspection of the dam and survey the water levels, I noticed the change cars, rooftops, street signs. My land was gone under concrete and cul-de-sacs. I was stunned but not surprised. Greed made men stupid, and homeowners associations were the embodiment of that greed. Instead of making a scene, I calmly went back to town, pulled up my original land surveys, consulted with the county recorder, and confirmed what I already suspected: no transfer had ever occurred. My property boundaries were intact. The HOA had built on stolen ground. I didn't go straight to court, I went to strategy. I hired a private investigator to confirm the HOA's internal communications, and what he uncovered made my blood boil. They knew. Weeks before breaking ground, they'd discovered the property was in legal limbo, but chose to press forward and deal with the fallout later. Leonard Harrows, the HOA president, even wrote in an email that by the time anyone figures it out, we'll have too many families living there for anyone to undo it. That was when I knew I wouldn't just sue. I'd make them feel every drop of entitlement they'd poured into the soil. First, I sent a cease and desist letter. The HOA ignored it. Then I filed a formal complaint with the county and a notice of encroachment. Still, nothing changed. That's when I remembered the dam. My dam, it had always been my ace card constructed decades ago with a reinforced steel gate. It held back nearly 30,000 cubic meters of water and was monitored by a gravity-fed release valve that only I controlled. It wasn't massive enough to threaten lives, but it was more than enough to reclaim the marshy lowlands the homes now sat on. The HOA had built without proper soil surveys, drainage infrastructure, or runoff planning because they didn't think they needed to. So I waited for the perfect storm, literally. That spring brought record rainfall. The reservoir swelled. The dam groaned under the pressure. And then, as the HO hosted a community barbecue with banners and children playing cornhole on stolen earth, I hiked up the hill and turned the wheel. Slowly, deliberately, the gates opened. Water surged. It took only minutes before the first culvert backed up, the soil softened, and the runoff turned the paved streets into muddy torrents. The water wasn't high enough to endanger lives, but it swallowed lawns, flooded basements, and unearthed the shaky foundations their cheap developer had buried under lies. I didn't stick around to watch the full damage. I didn't need to. The photos and footage posted by panicked residents did that for me. Leonard tried to call me, but I didn't answer. I let my attorney do the talking, sending a second letter one including a demand for removal, damages, and punitive compensation for trespassing, environmental damage, and unlawful occupation. Their response? Denial, followed by legal threats, followed by pleas for negotiation. They didn't realize this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. I had every document, every photo, and every drop of water on my side, and I was just getting started. The aftermath of the flood revealed just how fragile their little utopia really was, a community built not just on lies and stolen land, but on shortcuts, duct tape solutions, and smug confidence that no one would ever challenge them, until I did. The video spread like wildfire on local social media. Shaky cell phone footage of ankle-deep water sloshing through model homes, garden gnomes floating past minivans, HOA members screaming at each other as soggy paperwork from their community. Newsletter clung to storm drains, and through it all, one undeniable fact kept surfacing: they had no right to be there. The documents I had filed were airtight. My land patent predated their HOA by 70 years. When their lawyer finally contacted mine, they tried to spin it as an unfortunate misunderstanding, even offering to purchase the land at a fair market rate now that homes were already in place, as if I was the one who had made a mistake. That offer never even made it to my inbox. My attorney laughed and replied with a concise statement: "Vacate the property or face a lawsuit that will bankrupt your grandchildren. That was only phase 1. Phase 2 was the legal pressure. I filed suit in the county court, naming the HOA and all 35 homeowners as co-defendants. My claim wasn't just for trespass. It included unjust enrichment, environmental damage, and structural interference with my dam, which now had to be repaired due to their obstruction of its natural spill paths. Every home built had affected the basin's runoff profile, increasing the risk of erosion, silt blockage, and structural compromise. I included every engineering report, every hydrological survey, and every email from Leonard's smug chain of HOA approvals. When the court officially granted a preliminary injunction to stop any further construction or property transfers, panic set in. Homeowners who had bought in blindly, thinking they were moving into a safe, well-managed community, began to realize they were sitting on a ticking legal time bomb. Some tried to sell. No one was buying. Real estate agents wouldn't even list the homes once they saw the lawsuit paperwork. Others tried to sue the HOA itself for misrepresentation, and that's when the bloodbath began. Leonard tried to rally the community, framing me as some bitter old land baron who was holding families hostage over a clerical mistake. But the more he talked, the more his own residents turned on him. Because while he was giving speeches, I was holding town hall meetings, real ones. I rented out the old firehouse down the road and invited every homeowner. I brought my land surveyor, my lawyer, and even the county records clerk. I showed them the documents, the maps, the deeds, the court filings. I told them the truth. I didn't want to ruin their lives. I wanted justice. But justice meant they had to go. The reaction was mixed. Some screamed at me. One woman threw her HOA badge at the floor and cried, realizing the retirement home she and her husband had built was illegally standing on a foundation of lies. Another man tried to punch me. It didn't land, but many listened. Some even apologized, and a few quietly asked if I'd consider selling the parcels under their individual homes. I gave the same answer to each: not until the court decides. Meanwhile, I wasn't idle. I contracted a private hydrologist to begin full restoration plans for the dam and basin, submitted a request for an environmental impact assessment, and reached out to the press. The local paper picked up the story under the headline, HOA builds on wrong landowner fights back, and once that happened, the floodgates opened. Local TV ran a segment showing drone footage of the muddy, waterlogged development. An investigative journalist exposed the original developer now living overseas and wanted for real estate fraud in 3 counties. The public was eating it up. People who had been bullied by HOAs in the past cheered me on. Comments flooded in online, calling me the dam owner, the last landholder, and even Bridge Guy 2.0, but I wasn't doing this for fame. I was doing it because this was my land, and these people had walked all over it without so much as a phone call. They'd paved over my family's history, blocked deer paths, cut trees I'd planted as a boy, and dammed runoff channels they didn't understand. And now they were drowning in their own negligence. The court finally scheduled the preliminary hearing, and that day I showed up in boots and a button-down, with every folder meticulously tabbed. Leonard came in with 3 lawyers and an empty smile. The judge, an older woman with decades of land use experience, reviewed the documents, asked a few sharp questions, and within 20 minutes ruled in favor of extending the injunction and recommended mediation before trial. Leonard looked like he'd swallowed a hornet. Mediation gave them a chance to settle, but I had no interest in compromise, not until I saw accountability. That's when Leonard tried one last move. He called a secret meeting illegal under HOA bylaws, where they voted to levy a $20,000 emergency fee on every household to build a legal defense fund. It backfired spectacularly. Half the residents walked out. Several filed complaints with the state's HOA Oversight Board. One couple moved out in the middle of the night, abandoning their house with a "thanks for nothing" Leonard sign spray-painted on the garage. By now, 2 banks had begun foreclosure processes on homes whose buyers stopped paying due to uncertainty. The entire development was collapsing in on itself, and I hadn't even demanded they bulldoze it yet. I stood by the dam again one evening, looking down at the muddy remnants of their perfect streets, and I remembered my grandfather's words from when we installed the dam. "The land remembers what you do to it." The HOA had forgotten that. I hadn't, and neither had the water. And the water was still rising. The day the court rendered its final judgment was more than just a legal victory. It was the culmination of every sleepless night I'd spent reading statutes, every angry glare I'd received from homeowners who believed they were the victims, every drop of rain that fell onto that land knowing full well it didn't belong to them. The courtroom was packed. News cameras waited outside. Leonard sat hunched beside his attorneys, bags under his eyes, hands twitching. The judge's ruling was firm and clear. The Crestwood Pines HOA had willfully encroached upon private property, knowingly built without legal claim to the land, and ignored multiple formal warnings. Not only were they liable for damages and trespass, but the court also ruled that the structures, all 35 of them, would be subject to demolition or buyback by the rightful landowner, me, at a premium determined not by what the HOA thought they were worth, but by the cost of restoring the land to its original state. It hit them like a thunderclap. Residents gasped. Leonard went pale. One of the defense attorneys muttered something under his breath that sounded like a prayer. I didn't smile. I wasn't here for gloating. I was here for consequences. And the consequences were now crashing down on them like the dam water had weeks before. The headlines exploded. Judge orders demolition of unauthorized HOA homes. Landowner wins landmark case against subdivision built on stolen property. News vans camped outside my property for days. Commentators and talking heads debated whether the punishment was too harsh or entirely justified. Some residents still tried to paint me as the villain, the land baron with a grudge. But more and more people, especially those who read the court documents, understood the truth. The had gambled with other people's futures, and I simply called their bluff. As ordered, the HOA began the impossible process of trying to purchase the land under each home. But the values assessed by the court were astronomical, factoring in legal fees, restoration costs, and the irreversible ecological damage done by reroading water flow and clearing forest. One by one, homeowners walked away, handing over their keys, sometimes with letters taped to the door, some angry, some apologetic, and some just broken. I kept every letter. The demolition began 6 weeks later. Bulldozers rolled in, not with triumph, but with the solemn air of a funeral procession. House by house, brick by brick, the stolen community was unmade. I watched from the same ridge where I had once turned the valve, remembering the empty land that once lay there, the humming woods, the scatter of deer and foxes. Now I could begin to restore it. I partnered with a local conservation group, using part of the court-awarded damages to fund reforestation and native species rehabilitation. The dam was repaired with modern materials, now fitted with solar-powered monitoring equipment to prevent misuse and alert me to changes in pressure or blockage. I didn't intend to keep people off the land forever, but they would come back. The right way. Over time, I reopened portions of it for public hiking trails under conservation easements. allowing families to enjoy the landscape my family had protected for generations, but under my rules, my permits, my oversight, and there would never be an HOA anywhere near it again. As for Leonard, he resigned in disgrace shortly after the ruling. He was later sued by several of the homeowners for negligence and fraud, and last I heard he had moved states and was working in retail, far from real estate. Some might call that a fall from grace. I call it justice served chilled. The HOA itself was dissolved within the year, buried under a mountain of debt, failed settlements, and shattered reputations. But the story didn't end there. Months later, I was invited to speak at a landowners' rights conference where I shared everything: the history, the betrayal, the fight, the resolution. My speech went viral. People across the country reached out, some with their own HOA horror stories, others simply to say, "Thank you for standing your ground." And that was what it came down to, really. I didn't ask for this war, but when it came to me, I fought it with the full weight of truth, law, and legacy, because land isn't just dirt and trees. It's memory, it's bloodline, it's belonging. And when someone tries to pave over that for convenience or profit, they're not just building illegally, they're building on borrowed time. The land always remembers, the water always finds its way. And if you're foolish enough to ignore the signs, to disrespect the quiet power of roots and stone and stream, then one day, just like crestwood pines, you'll watch everything you built vanish beneath the surface. Not out of vengeance, but out of balance restored. And I'll be right there on the ridge, watching the dam hold steady, knowing that I did not let the trespass go unanswered. The land is mine. It always was. And now, finally, it knows peace.